My father didn't just steal my mother's money. He stole her sanity, her reputation, and 25 years of her life, while the rest of us watched and believed his lies. And it wasn't until I found the rusted key to Unit 402 that I realized the woman I called delusional was actually the only one of us living in reality. Imagine spending 2.5 decades being told you were losing your mind, being gaslit by the person who swore to love you, all while they were systematically draining every cent you earned to build a secret life you weren't invited to. Was I wrong for what I did once I found out the truth? Or would you have burned his entire world down just like I did? This whole nightmare started long before I was born, but I grew up in the shadow of my mother's episodes. To everyone in our small town, my father, David, was a saint. He was the stoic, hardworking provider who patiently dealt with a wife who was, as he put it, financially irresponsible and mentally fragile. My mother, Alina, was a successful freelance graphic designer back in the 90s, but my father took over the finances early on, claiming she couldn't be trusted with the stress of bills. I remember being 10 years old and hearing them argue in the kitchen because Mom couldn't understand why her account was always empty despite her working 14-hour days. Dad would just sigh that heavy, performative sigh, rub his temples, and tell her that her math was off again, or that she'd clearly forgotten about some imaginary debt he'd covered for her. He'd look at me and my sister, Sarah, with this pitying glance that said, "See what I have to deal with," and we fell for it. We grew up thinking Mom was the problem. We saw her go through bouts of deep depression and frantic searching through filing cabinets, and whenever she claimed money was missing, Dad would gently suggest she needed a higher dosage of her medication. He convinced her she was a shopaholic who blacked out and spent money, even though we never saw new things in the house. He made her feel like a ghost in her own life. As I got older, the gaslighting became more sophisticated. When Mom finally tried to leave him when I was 16, Dad somehow managed to convince the court that she was unfit. Using financial records he had forged to show she had squandered their savings. She stayed because she had nowhere to go and no money to her name, effectively becoming a prisoner in a house she paid for. Fast forward to last year, when Mom passed away from a sudden stroke. The grief was heavy, but Dad seemed more bothered by the paperwork than the loss of his wife of 30 years. He was quick to start clearing out her things, almost too quick. He told us to just toss her junk from her office, but something felt off. While I was packing up her old art supplies, I found a small, nondescript key taped to the underside of a drawer in her desk. There was no label, just a number, 402. I didn't tell Dad. I don't know why, maybe it was a gut instinct, but I waited until he was out of town for a business trip and tracked down the local storage facility it belonged to. When I opened that unit, I expected to find old clothes or maybe more art. Instead, I found the evidence of a 25-year heist. There were boxes upon boxes of bank statements, original invoices, and meticulously kept journals. My mother hadn't been crazy. She had been a detective. She had been tracking every single dollar Dad diverted from her professional accounts into a series of offshore and hidden domestic accounts I never knew existed. She had copies of checks he had forged, records of the secret property he bought in his mistress's name. Yes, a mistress he'd had for over a decade, and even recordings of him admitting to her that he was bleeding her dry just to see her crumble. She had been building a case, but she was too scared to use it while she was alive because he had threatened to take us away from her forever. Looking at those papers, I felt a physical sickness crawl up my throat. Every time she cried because she couldn't afford a new pair of shoes, every time he called her unstable in front of the neighbors, it was all a calculated move to keep his golden goose laying eggs while he plucked her feathers. I spent 3 days in that unit, reading through the life he stole from her. He had drained nearly $2 million over the course of their marriage. $2 million that should have been her security, our college funds, her peace of mind. Instead, it was sitting in an account that funded a second life for him 3 towns over. I sat there on a dusty crate, holding her journal where she wrote, "He thinks I'm forgetting, but I'm just waiting for the kids to be old enough to understand." Well, Mom, I'm old enough now. This is where I found myself at a crossroads. I had all the proof I needed to destroy his reputation, sue him for the estate, and possibly even see him face criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. But he is my father. If I do this, our family name is trashed, my sister's inheritance might vanish in legal fees, and the man who raised me becomes a monster in the eyes of the world. On the other hand, if I stay silent, I'm complicit in the theft of my mother's soul. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you protect the only parent you have left, or would you seek justice for the one who can no longer speak for herself? I decided that silence was no longer an option. I didn't go to the police first. I went to the other woman. I found the address Mom had noted in her files and drove there. I expected a villain, but what I found was another victim. A woman who believed Dad was a wealthy widower whose wife had died years ago. When I showed her the bank statements and the marriage certificate proving Mom had been alive until last month, her face went white. She had no idea she was living in a house bought with blood money. Together, we planned his homecoming. When Dad returned from his trip, he didn't find a grieving daughter. He found a living room filled with every single document from Unit 402. I had wallpapered the walls with his forged checks. Sarah was there, too, sobbing as she read the journals where Mom described his psychological abuse. When he walked in, he tried the poor Alina was confused routine one last time, but I played the recording Mom had hidden, the one where he laughed about how easy it was to make her look like a lunatic to the doctors. The look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face when he realized his reign of terror was over was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. I gave him an ultimatum: sign over everything. The house, the secret accounts, the properties, to Sarah and me, or we go to the authorities with the fraud evidence immediately. He tried to negotiate, he tried to cry, he even tried to blame Mom for forcing his hand. But I didn't budge. He signed. He's now living in a studio apartment, broke and alone, while the mistress has moved on and helped us testify in the civil suit to claw back the rest of the funds. My sister and I used a portion of the money to start a foundation in Mom's name for victims of financial abuse and gaslighting. It doesn't bring her back, and it doesn't erase the 25 years of trauma she endured. But every time I see her name on that building, I know she finally got the last word. My father still sends me letters from his tiny apartment, claiming I've ruined his life, and that I'm just like my mother. I take that as the highest compliment he could ever give me. He thought he could bury the truth in a storage unit, but the truth has a way of breathing even under a mountain of lies. I learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands by you when the world tells you you're crazy. My mother was the strongest person I ever knew, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever forgets her name or the truth of what she endured. Like this video if you were on my side, and think I did the right thing by stripping him of everything. Subscribe for more stories like this where the truth finally comes to light, and please share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Do you think he deserved even worse? I'll see you all in the next story.